So by and large, it was the initial conditions that determined how countries were affected and what institutions they had to ensure that particular groups were protected that determined really what happened in those economies. So I've talked about the situation with regard to prior to the reforms, and then we talk about performance soon after the reforms. The IMF projected that in most African countries, the GDP was going to slow down by 2 to 4 percentage points. That was quite huge for many of these countries that had only recently begun to experience good performance. There's enough research to show that in the past, 1 percentage point slowdown in global growth had a major, or 0.5 percentage point impact on the economy negatively. 2009 was expected to lead to changes in different countries. For Angola, Botswana, South Africa, Equatorial Guinea, and the Sudan, the IMF did predict a 4 percentage point decline in the rate of growth of the GDP. For Egypt, Kenya, and other countries, Sierra Leone, Lesotho, and so on, the decline was expected about 2 to 3 percentage points, and so on. For the whole of Africa, this is what we expected from 6.5% in 2002 to 2007. It was expected to decline to about 5.5%. That was very steep in 2008 and then 1% in 2009. So by all accounts, Africa was bound to take a major hit with this, and we see from this chart here how severe it was overall for the entire African region. In 2010, we expect a rebound, probably on the back of rising commodity prices, but also largely because of measures put in place by the governments themselves. I've made a point that the severity of the crisis varied from country to country. Let me talk briefly about Ghana. Ghana, as I said, has often been used as a country that has pursued reforms probably a lot more comprehensively and probably also a lot more consistently than many other countries. But Ghana, also like many other African countries, is often subject to policy reversals, often subject to changes in the political environment leading to changes in the way policy is pursued. So it doesn't surprise them that after a fairly good performance between 2002 and 2007, Ghana began in 2008 to pursue policies that were not in its own interest and were quite inimical to future performance. GDP growth slowed down from 7.3% in the wake of the crisis to 5% in 2009. Consider if you compare that to the trajectory that Ghana had been pursuing in the 8 years before, clearly there was no need for that reversal to occur, but it did occur. There was a major decrease in export earnings, largely as a result of volumes. One of the good things that happened for Ghana is that the prices of cocoa and gold, the major exports, did not change much in the period, but the volumes went down slightly, and this led to some decrease in export earnings. There was a major reduction in government revenue, largely because of the drop in exports. Export taxes went down significantly, and that affected government revenue also significantly. The deficit was reduced from 14% to 9.5% was projected, but we've seen that it's gone back to about 11%. And then there was a slow in remittances. The slow in remittances wasn't only in Ghana, but indeed occurred in many African countries. What is probably more significant? What probably more significant was the fact the decline in the portfolio investments. FDI inflows to Ghana had increased significantly by about 51% in the last 5 years, and then this we saw begin to decline rapidly. So I'm told I have only 5 minutes to go. This shows us what happened to inflation in Ghana at a time when it was going down in many other African countries. What was the government's response? That was basically the new government that came to the position that, well, it had to make do with whatever resources it had. The way to go about it was to make sure that spending was done in a much more selective manner than had been done in the 2-3 years before. Focus was on energy, infrastructure, and then social protection. and then some farming subsidies provided. The government removed import duties on key imports, including rice and wheat, largely as a response to the food problems that had been there earlier, the levy on oil, and then showed its commitment to low priority spending. Lessons learned, the key challenge in 2010 is seen as how best to manage the new expected oil resources. The government expects that flow of revenues from outside will increase as a result of the oil exports. It has to manage these resources much more effectively than has been done in other places. A major issue that confronts the Ghanaian economy is how to diversify, moving more into manufacturing and agriculture. These are two sectors that have not done well at all. Despite declining poverty figures, income inequality is quite high in Ghana, and so clearly there's a problem to be tackled. In Tanzania, we see probably better management of the macro situation. In Tanzania, we've seen the decline in the fall in the price of cotton. The government in Tanzania responded quite similarly. There was a major problem with earnings from tourism. The price of gold remained quite stable. Inflation rising, unemployment a major problem. Contracting FDI, indeed, as indeed many other African countries. Growth moved from 7.5% to 5%, as indeed in Ghana also. Indeed, in Tanzania was slightly higher than that. The government's response has been a lot more spending trying to stimulate the economy than was the case in Ghana. And this came largely because in Tanzania, the fiscal space was much larger than was the case in Ghana. We go to South Africa, and here clearly the hit was very severe. For the first time since 1932, South Africa is experiencing what we call a recession. That's quite important, probably the only African economy that had that kind of severity in the impact. We see the effects in the manufacturing and the mining sectors in South Africa. We've seen the problems with capital scarcity. We've seen the impact on the government tax revenue. I've also seen the impact on the current account deficit. The response, probably more so than in many other countries, has been to have this kind of stimulus package. And that stimulus package has been quite influential in making many households in South Africa respond to a difficult situation. There was a lot of emphasis in South Africa on small businesses, and that has been a major area of influence by the government. Quite a number of lessons learned in South Africa. We put a lot of emphasis on the lessons learned from the fiscal and monetary policies, how these can be used to mitigate the crisis. Zambia probably is the one country that took the biggest toll in terms of trade. We've seen the very, very sharp drop in the price of copper. And if you think of the fact that copper is probably the mainstay of the Zambian economy, then you can see the entire shrinkage in the economy. But as I made, the point I made at the beginning was countries that had good reforms and had started to strengthen institutions probably were able to weather the storm much, much better than others. So despite this terms of trade shock, huge terms of trade shock in Zambia, it was able to put in place some stimulus package. It was able to respond to poor households much more so than had been expected. This came largely because of the huge reserves built up in the years prior to the reforms. And that's a very important point we make. So in summary, I'd like to conclude that Africa has been quite hard hit. Indeed, I could have shown you from other figures that Africa may have suffered much more than other regions of the world in terms of impact on households, on the macroeconomy. But interestingly, the response to this new shock to the economy was much different from any other we've seen in Africa as compared to 1973 with the oil price and the first oil price shocks, when African economies behaved as if nothing had happened to their economies and continued to spend as if nothing had happened. This time around, your average African economy took into account the changes that had taken place in the world economy, restructured its budget. In 2009, your average African economy revised the budget 3 times.